In the dead of winter, when the wind cuts through the pines like a sharp blade, a chance encounter stirs memories buried deep beneath years of silence and solitude. This is the story of a man hardened by the wilderness, a rancher who thought he'd left the past behind, and a woman whose beauty hides a storm of secrets. Bound by a forgotten childhood promise, their reunion sets in motion a fight for freedom and love against the crushing chains of a brutal past and the unforgiving frontier law. Stay with us on this channel as we unravel a tale of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable bonds that tie us to our roots and to each other. The Montana Badlands in winter were a place where only the strongest survived, and even they bore scars. Snow hammered the high prairie with relentless fury, twisting through gnarled pines and scouring the lonely ranches that dotted the land between valleys. The wind, always hungry and cold, found every weakness, tearing warmth from wool, comfort from memory, hope from the hearts of those who dared call this place home. On a steel-gray afternoon, when the sky threatened worse to come, Eli Turner rode into the heart of that howling wilderness, his buffalo coat drawn tight against his broad shoulders, breath frosting before him in white puffs, saddle creaking beneath his weather-beaten frame. For 15 long years, Eli had built fences against the wind, driven cattle through impossible weather, mended barns with hands that knew every kind of work the frontier demanded. Grief and hardship had shaped him into something harder than the iron tools he wielded. A man with his heart carefully protected, worn smooth by loss and disappointment. At 35, his face showed every winter he'd endured, every summer that had baked him brown, every decision that had cost him something precious. But this particular day, something besides the coming blizzard pulled at him with invisible hands, urging him down the snow-choked trail toward Silver Creek. It was a need deeper than hunger, stronger than thirst, the yearning of roots not yet completely severed, of old promises that echoed in the wind, of ghosts that refused to stay buried. He rode with his faithful Mustang, Buck, whose slight limp served as a constant reminder that no one crossed these unforgiving lands without collecting scars along the way. Buck had been with him through the worst of it, drought summers when the grass turned to dust, winters when the cold could kill a man in his sleep, springs when flash floods turned peaceful creeks into raging torrents that swept away everything in their path. The horse's steady presence was one of the few constants in Eli's carefully constructed solitude. Silver Creek often looked like it was clinging to life by nothing but sheer stubborn pride and the determination of its inhabitants. Half a dozen painted storefronts huddled beneath the protective lee of a towering bluff, their weather-beaten signs swinging and creaking in the constant wind. Warm yellow candlelight flickering behind frost-etched windows like beacons of civilization in the wilderness. The town's rhythm matched the harsh land surrounding it, hard, spare, wary of newcomers and quick to judge strangers by the cut of their clothes and the steadiness of their gaze. Yet on this particular night, something was different. Music and laughter spilled like liquid gold from the small church at the end of the main street, defying both the storm and the town's usual reserved nature. As Eli rode slowly past townsfolk hurrying toward the celebration in their finest coats and dresses, curiosity began to kindle a slow, warm burn in his chest. Women clutched their shawls against the wind, while men bent their heads low, but all moved with the purposeful excitement of people anticipating something special. He left Buck with the stable boy, a freckled youth named Tommy who'd grown up knowing every horse in the territory, and made his way across the street to the Frontier Inn. The building stood solid and welcoming, its windows glowing with the promise of warmth and hot food. Inside, the air was thick with the mingled scents of wood smoke, simmering beef stew, and the faint sweetness of cornbread fresh from the oven. Mason Reed, the innkeeper, looked up from his ledger with eyes that had seen everything the frontier could offer. Bald as an eagle, gruff as a bear, fighting the inevitable march of years with whiskey and determination, he studied Eli's face with the practiced gaze of a man who'd learned to read character in a glance. After a moment's assessment, he slid a brass key across the worn wooden counter with a grunt of approval. "Celebration's mighty big across the road tonight," Reed said, jerking his chin toward the church. Carter Hayes finally found himself a bride, imported from back east no less. Whole town's been needing an excuse for good food and music. He chuckled, but his gaze lingered on Eli's weathered features, as if searching for the story behind why a man would risk deadly weather to reach Silver Creek on this particular night. Eli settled by the stone fireplace, letting the heat seep into his bones while his boots dried and steamed on the hearth. Around him, the few townsfolk who'd stayed behind spoke in quiet murmurs about the weather, the prospects for spring, and the surprising romance that had brought such excitement to their usually quiet community. Outside, periodic gusts rattled the windows and sent snow swirling past the glass in hypnotic patterns, carrying with them a sense of foreboding. Something unspoken, the way small towns grow quiet before a storm breaks over more than just rooftops and chimneys. The laughter and music drifting in from the church created ribbons of joy that felt almost out of place on such a brutal night, yet somehow perfectly suited to people who'd learned to celebrate whenever they could steal a moment from the harsh realities of frontier life. Eli found himself drawn to the window, curiosity overcoming his usual preference for solitude. He gazed out just in time to witness the wedding party beginning to emerge from the warm glow of the church. First came Carter Hayes himself, bold as brass in his finest black suit, broad-shouldered and radiating the unmistakable confidence of a man who'd never lost a fight he hadn't carefully rigged in his favor. His thick hand, possessive and commanding, clamped firmly around the delicate arm of his new wife as if she were a prize he'd won rather than a woman who'd chosen him. But it was she who captured Eli's attention completely, stealing his breath and stopping his heart mid-beat. She moved through that winter landscape like sunlight made flesh, her white wedding dress shining with an otherworldly glow that seemed to defy the gray storm swirling around her. The gown was simple but elegant, perfectly suited to a frontier wedding, yet somehow suggesting refinement that belonged in drawing rooms rather than mining towns. Her dark hair, elaborately pinned beneath a modest lace veil, caught what little light the storm allowed, and when she lifted her face to look at the swirling snow, every detail of her features came flooding back to him with devastating clarity. The sight of her, the proud yet somehow fragile set of her shoulders, the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite the obvious strain, the particular tilt of her head when something caught her attention, punched a hole through Eli's carefully maintained emotional defenses. Even from across the street, even through the veil and the gathering darkness, he could see elements that belonged to memories he'd buried deep. The delicate curve of her jaw, the graceful line of her neck, the way she moved with unconscious elegance. Before reason could intervene or caution could hold him back, she turned as if sensing the intensity of his gaze. Her eyes swept across the faces of well-wishers until they found and locked with his through the inn window. The shock of recognition that passed between them was sharp as the winter wind, immediate and undeniable. Time seemed to collapse, 23 years folding in on themselves like pages in a book, until suddenly he was 12 years old again, racing barefoot through sun-warmed grass, while her musical laughter rang through summer twilight. Anna Clark. The name exploded in his memory like thunder. The neighbor girl who'd shared his childhood adventures, who'd helped him catch fireflies in mason jars during magical summer evenings, and waded fearlessly in the creek beside him, searching for arrowheads and smooth stones perfect for skipping. Anna, whose family had vanished one terrible night when their barn erupted in flames, taking her beloved father with it and scattering the survivors like autumn leaves in a harsh wind. Her shock was unmistakable and immediate. Her lips parted in a silent gasp, her green eyes widening with recognition and something that might have been desperate hope. Despite Carter Hayes's firm grip on her arm and the crowd of celebrating townsfolk pressing around them, despite the impropriety and the risks, she pulled free from her husband's possessive grasp and began walking with determined purpose straight toward the inn. Her white dress dragged through the accumulating snow, but she seemed oblivious to everything except the need to reach him, to confirm that what she was seeing was real and not some cruel trick of memory and longing. Her eyes never wavered from his face as she crossed the street, each step deliberate and brave. Eli found himself moving without conscious decision, drawn by forces far stronger than reason or social convention. He pushed through the inn's heavy door and stood on the threshold as she approached, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The cold air hit him like a physical blow, but he barely noticed. Up close, he could see how beautiful she'd become. Not the pretty child he remembered, but a woman of perhaps 27 who'd grown into her features with the kind of refined elegance that seemed completely out of place in this rough mining town, yet somehow perfectly suited her essential nature. She stopped just before him, close enough that he could see the familiar gold flecks in her green eyes that he'd memorized during countless childhood adventures. Close enough to catch the faint, sweet scent of lavender that clung to her despite the harsh wind and falling snow. For a long moment that stretched like an eternity, they simply stared at each other, drinking in the impossible reality of this reunion, trying to reconcile the adults they'd become with the children they'd once been. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear above the howling wind, carrying the weight of years and loss and desperate hope. "Do you recognize me, rancher? I was your childhood neighbor." The words struck Eli like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and threatening to buckle his knees. The formal distance of rancher, the careful politeness that couldn't quite hide the tremor in her voice, the way she searched his face for any sign that he remembered, all of it combined to create a moment of such intense emotion that he feared he might shatter from the force of it. "Anna," he managed to say, her real name emerging from his throat, rough with emotion and memory. She smiled then, a heartbreakingly beautiful expression that mixed joy with unbearable sadness, hope with resignation. It was an expression that nearly destroyed what remained of his carefully constructed emotional walls. "No one's called me that in years," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "It's Elizabeth now, Elizabeth Hayes. As of about 10 minutes ago." The bitterness in her tone was subtle but unmistakable, and behind her he could see her new husband pushing through the crowd of well-wishers, his face darkening with anger and suspicion at finding his bride in intimate conversation with a strange man. "You left," Eli said, the words coming out clumsy and inadequate, his usual eloquence destroyed by the flood of memories and emotions crashing over him. "After the fire, you all just disappeared without a word, without a trace." Her expression grew pained, shadows of old grief and fresh regret crossing her delicate features. She glanced quickly over her shoulder at her approaching husband before answering, her words rushed and urgent. "We had to leave. Mother couldn't bear to stay after losing father so suddenly, so violently. The memories were everywhere, in every room of the house, every corner of the barn, every path through the fields. Uncle Theodore offered us sanctuary in Portland, a chance to start over where nobody knew our tragedy." She looked back at him with eyes that held years of accumulated regret and what-if scenarios. "Mother wanted to forget everything about Wyoming, the farm we'd built with such hope, the life we'd created together, the friends we'd made, all of it. She said looking back would only bring more pain." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "But I never forgot. I always wondered what became of you, Eli. When I heard rumors about a rancher who traded in these territories, something deep inside me dared to hope." Her words were cut off as Carter Hayes's voice boomed across the snowy street like a whip crack, filled with barely controlled anger and possessive fury. "Elizabeth Hayes! What in blazes are you doing out here?" His tone brooked no argument, demanded immediate obedience, and carried the unmistakable threat of consequences for defiance. Anna flinched at the harsh sound of his voice, but didn't immediately turn away from Eli. Instead, displaying a courage that reminded him painfully of the fearless girl she'd once been, she reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the inn's doorframe. Her fingers were ice cold, even through her delicate white gloves, and he could feel them trembling, whether from cold, emotion, or fear, he couldn't tell. "I'm glad I got to see you again," she whispered with desperate urgency, her words coming fast as footsteps crunched through the snow behind her. "I'm glad to know you survived, that you're alive and well, that you made a life for yourself out here in this beautiful, terrible country." Then Carter Hayes was there, his heavy presence looming over them both as he seized Anna's arm with practiced proprietary roughness. His grip was immediately possessive, the kind that would leave marks on delicate skin, and Eli could see Anna's slight wince of pain even as she tried to hide it. "You'll excuse my wife," Hayes said to Eli, though his tone carried absolutely no apology or politeness. "She's clearly overwhelmed by the excitement of the day and doesn't know what she's doing." Every instinct Eli possessed screamed at him to intervene, to tear Anna away from this man whose grip was already leaving white marks on her pale skin. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment the civilized veneer he'd carefully maintained threatened to crack entirely. But he knew the harsh, unforgiving rules of frontier society, even in a relatively progressive town like Silver Creek. Anna was married now, legally and morally bound to Hayes by both law and custom. In the eyes of society and the law, she belonged to another man, no matter what history she and Eli shared or what feelings still existed between them. "My apologies for any impropriety," Anna said formally, her training in Eastern manners serving her even in this emotional moment. She allowed herself to be led away toward Hayes's imposing house at the edge of town, but her eyes remained locked on Eli's face until the very last moment. In those green depths, he read a complex mixture of emotions: desperation, fear, longing, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of hope that somehow, some way, this encounter might lead to something more than just a painful reminder of what they'd lost. The wedding party moved on through the swirling snow, their voices and laughter gradually fading into the storm until only the wind remained. Eli stood in the doorway long after they'd disappeared from sight, his mind reeling with the impossibility of what had just happened. Anna Clark, here in Silver Creek of all the places in the vast territory, married to a man who clearly saw her as property rather than a partner, trapped in a life that seemed as far from her gentle nature as the Montana Badlands were from the green fields of Wyoming. He finally forced himself back inside, climbed the creaking stairs to his rented room, and tried unsuccessfully to sleep. Outside, the storm struck the town with renewed fury, rattling windows and howling through every gap in the walls like some wild, living thing determined to tear civilization apart and return the land to its primitive state. But Eli barely noticed the weather's violence. His mind was completely occupied with memories of summer evenings 23 years in the past, a boy and girl sitting by a babbling creek, making innocent promises to be friends forever, sharing dreams and secrets under a canopy of stars that had seemed as permanent as their childhood bond. Those memories hurt worse than any physical wound the wilderness had ever inflicted on him, cutting deeper than broken bones or knife wounds, leaving scars on his soul that he'd thought had finally healed. The sight of Anna as a grown woman, beautiful but obviously trapped in an unhappy marriage, had torn those old wounds open again and left them bleeding freely. As dawn broke gray and cold over Silver Creek, painting the snow-covered buildings in shades of pewter and pale gold, Eli made a decision that would change the course of both their lives forever. He couldn't simply ride away and abandon Anna to whatever fate awaited her as Carter Hayes's wife. The glimpse of fear he'd seen in her eyes, the way she'd flinched when her husband grabbed her arm, the desperate quality of her whispered words. All of it painted a picture of a woman in genuine danger, trapped by circumstances and society's expectations in a situation that could destroy her. Over the following days, as the storm gradually cleared and normal life resumed in Silver Creek, Eli made it his business to learn everything he could about Carter Hayes and his various enterprises. What he discovered filled him with growing alarm and determination. Hayes owned the largest freight company in the territory, holding contracts to supply mining camps scattered throughout the treacherous mountain passes. His success had made him wealthy and influential, with connections reaching all the way to the territorial capital. But there were darker rumors, too, whispered in saloons and general stores by men who'd had dealings with Hayes and lived to regret it. Stories of business competitors who'd crossed him and met with unfortunate accidents, falls from horses, attacks by bandits, mysterious illnesses that struck just when someone was becoming inconvenient. tales of freight drivers who'd asked too many questions about suspicious shipments and simply vanished into the wilderness, their empty wagons found days later with no trace of their occupants. The more Eli learned, the more determined he became to help Anna escape from what was clearly becoming a dangerous situation. But he also realized he couldn't act alone. Fortunately, he found unexpected allies among Silver Creek's residents. Jake Coleman, a former cavalry scout who'd tangled with Hayes in business dealings and come away convinced the man was fundamentally corrupt, agreed to help gather evidence. Frank Dawson, Hayes's nervous bookkeeper who'd been keeping 2 sets of books and losing sleep over his complicity in illegal activities, proved willing to cooperate when offered protection and a way out of his predicament. Dr. Harper, the town's physician and one of the few men whose integrity Hayes couldn't buy or intimidate, became another crucial ally when he began treating Anna for injuries that couldn't possibly have resulted from simple clumsiness or household accidents. The good doctor's professional discretion prevented him from speaking publicly about his patient's condition, but his grim expressions and carefully neutral statements spoke volumes to those who knew how to read between the lines. As winter slowly gave way to the first tentative hints of spring, the situation in the Hayes household grew increasingly volatile. Anna, struggling to maintain her dignity and sanity while adapting to her husband's escalating demands and violent temper, found herself walking an ever narrower line between survival and defiance. Hayes, meanwhile, grew more paranoid and controlling as his business empire began to show signs of the strain caused by his illegal activities and reckless spending. The breaking point came on a night when the first warm winds of spring were beginning to melt the accumulated snow, creating treacherous patches of mud and ice throughout the town. Anna, seeking a few moments of solitude and peace, had slipped from her house and made her way to the small church where her wedding had taken place. She knelt in the candlelit silence, praying for strength, for courage, for some way out of the nightmare her life had become. Eli, who'd been keeping watch over the Hayes house whenever possible, saw her leave and followed at a discreet distance. When she beckoned him to join her in the church, he entered quietly and sat beside her in the front pew. Their conversation was halting and careful, heavy with everything that couldn't be said aloud for fear that even the walls themselves might carry their words back to hostile ears. Anna confessed her fears about her husband's increasingly erratic behavior, his violent rages when crossed, and his growing suspicions about her past connections to other men. Eli, in turn, shared what he'd learned about Hayes's business dealings and the very real danger she faced if she remained in the marriage. They spoke in whispers, their words barely audible above the soft whisper of wind through the church rafters, but their meaning was crystal clear. They were both willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom and happiness together. But such moments of sanctuary were inevitably short-lived. Hayes discovered Anna's absence and tracked her to the church, arriving with several of his most trusted men just as she and Eli were preparing to leave. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Hayes dragged his wife away with barely controlled violence, while his men made it clear that Eli would be wise to leave town immediately or face serious consequences. The incident marked the beginning of an escalating series of confrontations between Hayes and those who dared to oppose him. The freight company owner, sensing that his carefully constructed empire was beginning to crumble, became increasingly desperate and dangerous. His treatment of Anna grew worse, confined now to the house, except for carefully supervised public appearances, and the signs of abuse became impossible to hide from the town's increasingly concerned residents. The final catalyst came when one of Hayes's freight wagons, carrying a shipment that was supposed to save his failing business, was ambushed in a remote canyon outside town. The driver was found shot and barely alive, the valuable cargo missing, and Hayes's public reaction was so extreme that it raised suspicions among even his most loyal supporters. Eli, working with Jake Coleman, investigated the scene and discovered evidence suggesting the robbery had been an inside job. Cigarette stubs of a brand favored by Hayes's own men, tracks that led back toward town rather than into the wilderness where genuine bandits might flee. As Eli quietly rallied the growing number of townspeople who were tired of living under Hayes's tyranny, the situation reached a crisis point. Hayes, cornered by mounting evidence of his crimes and facing the very real possibility of federal investigation, grew increasingly unstable and violent. Anna, bearing the brunt of his fury and paranoia, began to fear for her life. The breaking point came with fire. On a night when spring storms brought lightning and high winds to Silver Creek, the Hayes carriage house erupted in flames. Anna, who'd been locked in her room as punishment for some perceived slight, found herself trapped as smoke began to fill the upper story of the main house. Hayes, drunk and raging about his business troubles, made no move to help his wife, despite the obvious danger. It was Eli who smashed down the locked door and carried Anna to safety through smoke and collapsing timbers, risking his own life to save the woman he'd never stopped loving. The rescue was witnessed by half the town, and the obvious evidence that Anna had been deliberately locked in during the fire turned public opinion decisively against Hayes. In the aftermath of the fire, as Dr. Harper treated Anna for smoke inhalation and revealed evidence of systematic abuse, the full scope of Hayes's crimes began to emerge. Frank Dawson, finally finding the courage to act, produced his hidden ledgers showing years of fraud, embezzlement, and insurance scams. Sheriff Harlan, pressured by both outside lawmen and increasingly angry townsfolk, was forced to issue warrants for Hayes's arrest, despite his previous reluctance to act against such an influential citizen. Hayes, cornered like the dangerous animal he'd always been, responded with characteristic violence. Rather than face justice through legal channels, he challenged Eli to a duel, the kind of frontier justice he believed in when civilized law threatened to hold him accountable for his actions. It was to be a fight to the death in the middle of Silver Creek's main street, with the entire town as witnesses. On the morning of the confrontation, as pale sunlight struggled through lingering storm clouds, Silver Creek held its collective breath. Anna, wounded but determined, watched from Dr. Harper's window as the two men who'd shaped her adult life prepared to face each other in mortal combat. In her hands, she clutched a borrowed rifle, ready to intervene if treachery threatened the man she loved. When the church bell struck noon, both men stepped into the muddy street. Hayes, confident in his reputation as a gunfighter, swaggered to his position with the cocky assurance of someone who'd never lost such a contest. Eli, quieter but no less determined, checked his father's old Colt revolver one final time and thought of all the reasons he had to live and to ensure that Anna would finally be free. At the signal, neither man hesitated. Their pistols cleared leather simultaneously, flame and thunder erupting in the thin mountain air. Eli staggered as Hayes's bullet grazed his ribs, painting his shirt with blood, but his own aim was true. His shot shattered Hayes's gun arm and dropped the man to his knees in the muddy street. Hayes, wild-eyed with pain and the realization that his reign of terror was finally ending, made one last desperate attempt at victory. His left hand snaked toward a hidden derringer tucked in his boot, but Sheriff Harlan's rifle spoke first, ending Carter Hayes's life and his threat to Silver Creek forever. With Hayes dead and his criminal empire exposed to federal investigation, Anna was finally free to make her own choices about her future. She chose Eli, choosing love over security, wilderness over the constraints of Eastern civilization, freedom over the gilded cage that respectable society had tried to build around her. Together they rode out of Silver Creek toward Eli's ranch in the Montana Badlands, leaving behind the ghosts of their separate, painful pasts to build a future founded on mutual love and respect. In the vast silence of the mountains, surrounded by nothing but endless sky and ancient stone and the promise of seasons yet to come, they found the peace and happiness that had eluded them both for so many years. Their wedding was simple but deeply meaningful, a ceremony performed by Luke Garrett, an old friend who served as a circuit riding minister, with their closest friends gathered under the infinite Montana sky. Anna wore her mother's simple gold band and a dress she'd sewn herself from practical blue calico, more beautiful in Eli's eyes than any elaborate gown could have been. The years that followed brought both hardships and joys in equal measure. There were brutal winters when cattle were lost to storms and wolves, drought summers when the grass turned to dust and water had to be carried from distant streams. But there was also laughter echoing across the valleys, the satisfying work of building something lasting together, and eventually children who grew up tough as the land yet gentle, with the hope their parents had fought so hard to preserve. On quiet evenings when the work was done and the children were asleep, Eli and Anna would sit on their cabin's porch, watching the sun paint the western mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes Anna would rest her head on her husband's shoulder and whisper, "Do you recognize me, rancher? I was your childhood neighbor." And Eli would always reply, "You're more than that now. You're my heart, my home, my future." Their love story became legend in the Montana Territory, the tale of the rancher and his brave, beautiful bride who defied convention, overcome tragedy, and built a life together based on choice rather than circumstance. It served as proof to all who heard it that even in the wildest, most unforgiving places, love not only survives but sometimes conquers everything that stands in its way. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the American frontier, where courage was measured in actions rather than words, where love proved stronger than law, and where two hearts found each other again, despite all the forces that tried to keep them apart. Stay with this channel for more stories of the indomitable human spirit that built the American West, one heart, one choice, one act of courage at a time.